Well, good morning or afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are located in the United States here. Welcome to our CBE event hosted by the subcommittee of the CBE, the Living the Dharma subcommittee. This subcommittee tries to put on Buddhist educational events that relate specifically to Buddhism in everyday life. And so it's more of a practical nature, experiential nature. And today we have as our guest speaker Gregg from the ToDo Institute, all the way in Vermont. Gregg has been a personal friend for many years now for me. And when I was a minister at Orange County Buddhist Church, we had him as a guest speaker numerous times. He has spoken at many of our BCA temples, and a few years ago was the keynote speaker at the Federation of Dharma School Teachers League conference, in which he introduced Naikan therapy to all the Dharma School teachers. He is also the chair of our new BCA task force titled Buddhism and Spiritual and Psychological Well-Being, in which we're trying to connect Buddhism and the many mental health issues that we all face and that many people face. So today, we asked him to speak on the topic of conflict resolution. And so his title is Can We Grow Relationship Lotuses from Muddy Conflicts? Strategies on how to deal with conflict and disagreements. And there isn't anyone who's not alive that doesn't have some kind of experience with either a family relationship conflict or someplace at work or with friends. So as human beings, we all deal with interpersonal conflicts, and we look forward to hearing Gregg's perspective on this today. So I'd like to turn it over to Gregg Leach now from the ToDo Institute.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Harada, for that nice introduction. And want to thank you and Judy and the committee for allowing me to have a few minutes to talk to you today about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, since I've been married for 32 years to my wife, Linda. And most of what I've learned about conflict and conflict resolution actually comes from that relationship. So, so I want to get started, and I am going to try to kind of condense a lot of material into a short period of time. I want to make sure that we have time for people to make comments and ask questions. So I'm going to start by going ahead and sharing my screen so you can see some graphics while I'm doing this. So I want to start by basically giving you kind of the reason that I think that this is such an important theme, this idea of working with conflict and disagreement. So my daughter, my oldest daughter, just moved this past week to Pensacola, Florida. She's getting married on November 9th. And she's in the process of reserving venues for the ceremony and for the reception. And it's clear from her attempts to do that there's other couples also in the area that are getting married on the same day. So statistically, if there were 5 couples who were getting married on that day, there would be 2 new divorces to kind of match up to the 5 people who got married. And that's, I think, a kind of a very practical way to really look at this issue of the divorce rate in our country. So about 44% of marriages will end in divorce. And that really means that if 5 people get married on that day, 2 or a little more than 2 actually will get divorced. So, so that's one example of, I think, the limitations we have in terms of kind of working with conflict and disagreement. I think one of the areas that's been interesting in recent years is this issue of family estrangement. And so here's the results of a survey that was done that indicates that 1 in 4 Americans are not speaking with their father or mother or sibling. They have little or no contact. They're not in communications with those people in their family. And if someone's estranged, from even one member of their family, of course, it affects the whole family. Everybody else gets involved, and so it creates great suffering for the entire family, even if just there's two people in the family who basically aren't talking or communicating. So there was a recent article in the New York Times, and actually a whole series of articles that seemed to come out at the same time just a few weeks ago about this idea of family estrangement. One of the things that surprised me was that there is now a growing number of therapists, including what they call Instagram therapists, I guess, who are actually encouraging people to disconnect from family members if they think those family members are toxic. And it's not a question of the family members are toxic. It's a question of whether the person thinks that they're toxic. So we end up in this situation where I think there's a growing number, particularly of young people, who have disconnected from their immediate or core families as a result of conflict that isn't basically being handled skillfully. So the result is that the family kind of ends up being disconnected from one another. And then finally, just this issue of family violence. And while men make up the largest percentage of homicide victims in the world, more than half of the women that are killed are actually killed by their intimate partners or other family members. So when we talk about family, we talk about conflict in family settings, we're not just talking about divorces or separations or even estrangement. We're actually talking about murder, that a huge number of people, in this case, particularly women, are actually being murdered by other family members. Excuse me. So does Buddhism and the Dharma have something that to offer the world, a world that doesn't seem to know how to get along with one another, even our own family members? And I think it does. Today, I want to talk about focus, mostly on close personal relationships, families, intimate relationships, and conflict resolution in those relationships. And a lot of what I'm going to say, I think, is also applicable to relationships that aren't so close and personal, but that's really going to be kind of my main focus today. And so the question is, can we look at the principles of Buddhism and look at the mechanics of conflict resolution and find some kind of approach that would help us to resolve problems and get along better? And the way I'm going to organize, the way I have organized this talk today, is to start out by looking at some key principles in Buddhism that I think are related to relationships and conflict resolution. And then the second part is to really talk very specifically about the mechanics of actually how we might sit down with a person where there's an argument or a difference and try to resolve that conflict. What I'd like to do is to go through some of the principles first, and then maybe see if it's possible, if people have any comments or questions about that, just briefly, and then go into the second part, which has to do with the mechanics of conflict resolution. So let's start by looking at some of the principles that I'd like to make reference to. So the first one is interdependence. I imagine many of you, if you're practicing Buddhists or you're affiliated with a temple, are familiar with these principles. But when you're in a close relationship with someone, you're in the same boat, right? You either sail or you sink or you swim together, and you're connected. Aspects of your life are connected. Your emotional lives are often kind of very connected. It's very hard to be happy in a relationship if the other person is very unhappy, and so we're connected to the person in practical ways. We're connected to them in emotional ways. And so if you win an argument, if you're having an argument with someone you're close to like that, it could be your partner, it could be a aging parent, it could be an adult child. If you win that argument, so to speak, the relationship really loses that argument, because it's not healthy for the relationship to have one person winning. And so when we go into a conflict resolution situation with someone we're close to, uh, we don't really think of it, we shouldn't be thinking of it as from a standpoint of winning or losing. We should be thinking of it from a standpoint of how can we come up with a solution or a conclusion that everybody can live with, hopefully everybody can be satisfied with, and nobody feels that they kind of lost and nobody really feels that they've won. And that's really the kind of resolution that in which I think the relationship actually wins. But it starts with this recognition of interdependence. So if you have the presence of mind when you're sitting across from a loved one to remember this, you realize that you may be angry at the person at the time, they may be angry at you, but you're not trying to hurt them, because by hurting them, you're really hurting yourself and you're hurting the relationship. The second principle I'd like to make reference to is impermanence, or more specifically, the kind of dynamic nature of life. So I've been married to Linda for 32 years, which comes out to, actually, I checked this. So for today, it comes out to 11,619 days. But if you ask me, how many times have you been married? I would say I've been married 11,619 times, because I've basically married, every day I'm married to a different woman. And every day Linda is married to a different man. You know, we're not the same person from day to day. It's sometimes not that noticeable from day to day, but I saw a picture of us from 20 years ago at some kind of conference that we went to, and we don't look the same as we did 20 years ago. So a lot of things have changed. Our physical bodies have changed, but not just that. Our work has changed. Our jobs have changed since we've been married. Our diets have changed, and then they changed back, and then they changed again. We have a lot of dietary changes over the last 32 years. Our preferences about music and about clothing has changed. So nothing really is settled, because each person in the relationship is in a constant dynamic state of change. So when we realize that, you can't ever actually resolve anything on any permanent basis, because you may agree to something one day, but the next week or the next month or the next year, that person has a different perspective, or you have a different perspective, and suddenly you have to renegotiate or rediscuss that same kind of topic. And so in the 32 years that I've been married, I find that Linda and I are continually kind of replanning and reassessing our lives and what to do next and what direction to go in. And some of that involves conflict, because it's just a very natural thing. I sometimes have to remind myself that we're not the same person. And so all we have to do is kind of sit down for dinner, and I realize that she likes certain kind of food. She likes onions. I don't really like onions. And so if we we're the same person, we would both like onions. And it sounds so basic, but sometimes when we're with somebody for many, many years, we forget that they're actually a different person. They have different ways of looking at things. They have different values. They have different karma that they bring into that relationship. So impermanence, I think, is a real important Buddhist principle to think about as we think about how to create healthy and loving relationships. In the Tanisho, which is a primary source of the Dharma in Shin Buddhism, there's this quote: "We do not know the depth of karmic evil, and we do not know the height of the Tathagata's benevolence, all of which cause us to live in utter confusion." And one of my favorite Buddhist teachers, the late Reverend Tai Uno, says that this dual failing is a source of unending suffering in our world. So the same principle, I think, can be applied to our relationship with people, that we don't really see and understand the extent of the problems and difficulties and disappointments and frustration and inconveniences that we cause to this other person that we're close to. And we're blind to many of the ways that we cause difficulties to that person. And I think we also don't really understand the degree to which that person supports us and helps us, and offers us kindness and loves us in kind of very practical ways on a day-to-day basis. We sometimes take those things for granted when that person makes the coffee every day. We just kind of take that for granted. Or there are things that they do that we're not even aware of because we don't see them doing those things. So in the same way that I think we look at this principle of the our inability to have this type of dual awareness spiritually, I think it actually applies also to individual relationships that we're in, that we don't see the kind of suffering that we cause, and we don't see the great support and love that we receive from that person. I also wanted to mention that description is actually a very fitting description for a little baby, an infant, right? That they don't understand the trouble and difficulty they're causing, and that little baby doesn't understand the level of care and love that they're receiving. And so as we get older and we're no longer babies, I think we become more polite, right? And but I'm not actually sure that we ever abandoned the kind of ignorance that we have as a baby, and where we can't see those things from the people who are around us. Some of you know the terms jiriki and tariki. Jiriki is often translated as self-power, and tariki as other power. And so in Buddhism, we talk about jiriki in terms of self-power as kind of our own efforts to kind of lift ourselves up, our own efforts to become spiritually aware, our own efforts to become enlightened, and our own efforts just in practical life to succeed, to become successful in our lives. So when jiriki is kind of the dominant characteristic of the way that we view our life, then we attribute so much of our success and our happiness to ourselves, to our hard work and our efforts. And of course, we may be working hard and we may be making efforts, but the perspective that comes from tariki, which means other power, is really to see those things much more as coming from grace, right? And in Shin Buddhism as coming from grace from Amida. But in my view, that grace manifests itself as having food in the refrigerator, or being able to still have my eyesight, or being able to still be able to walk, or having a car that can get me around, or being married to a woman who loves me. Those are all forms of grace. And so from a tariki standpoint, if that characteristic dominates the way we see our life, then there's a very strong theme of gratitude and appreciation that runs through our life. Whereas if the dominant characteristic is jiriki, then there's a very strong theme of pride and kind of being very self-satisfied, and a sense of self-reliance. And I think this also applies to our personal relationships, that if we are recognizing the other power in our life, and including the benevolence of that other power that comes through these people that we're close to, our partners and our family members and others, then we naturally find ourselves responding from a perspective of being grateful, because it's not a situation where we feel like we've earned those benefits or we've earned that love. And that's what I think really defines grace, because you can be grateful for something and still feel like you've earned it. But when you don't have a sense that you've earned it, that you deserve it, then it becomes grace. And I think when we bring a jiriki perspective into our relationship, often when I've worked with couples who are having problems, for example, the classic position is each person kind of pointing the finger at the other person. And one element of that is people looking at the other person and saying, this person isn't contributing enough. They're not doing enough. I'm carrying the big load in this relationship, and the other person isn't doing their fair share. And of course, the other person has the exact same perspective. So we know mathematically that that's not possible. But because each person is looking at what they're doing, and they're looking at what the other person isn't doing, they end up taking this perspective that really is a perspective that is not coming out of a Tauriki view of that relationship, but out of a Jiriki view. And so I'd like to talk about this one more idea from the Dharma that comes from a Zen teacher named Charlotte Joko Beck, who died a number of years ago. And I've put this quote up, which I'm going to put on the screen now. It's a very dense quote. I'll read it to you because the screen here, it's going to be hard to read. But she says, the point of a relationship has nothing to do with the relationship itself. The point of a relationship is the added power that life gets in working with it as a channel. A good relationship gives life more power. If two people are strong together, the life has a more powerful channel than it has with two single people. It's almost as though a third and larger channel has been formed. That's what life has been looking for. It doesn't care whether you are happy in your relationship. What it's looking for is a channel, and it wants that channel to be powerful. If it's not powerful, life would just as soon discard it. It's looking for channels for its power so it can function maximally. And that function is what you are all about. All this drama about you and him or her is of no interest to life. Life is looking for a channel, and like a strong wind, it will beat on a relationship to test it. When a relationship isn't working, it means that the partners are preoccupied with what I want is, or this isn't right for me. So when I first came across this quote, I found it very interesting. And so I'd like to actually just add a few comments to this and see if this makes any sense to you. So generally, we see our relationship from inside the relationship, which is to say that we see it from our own personal perspective, right? We see life through the question, how does this affect me? And that filters the way that we see the world around us and the way that we see our life. And I think that's even true when we look at a partner, even somebody we're close to or someone we love. Most of the time, our natural way of looking at it is, how does this person affect me? So this person is doing this, and because they're doing this, it agitates me. So what I'm really looking at is how what they're doing affects me. Oh, but now they're not doing something I want them to do, and that really frustrates and disappoints me. So I'm still looking at this question: how does this person affect me, right? And I think what Joko Beck is saying here is she's offering us a much larger perspective. You know, sometimes when we do Naikan reflection, which I'll talk about a little bit today, but sometimes when we do Naikan reflection, we get a glimpse of what it's like for the other person to actually be connected to us, to deal with us. And sometimes that's a real shock, real surprise. But I think what Joko Beck is suggesting is a perspective that comes from even beyond our human existence. In fact, after I reread this recently, I tried reading it again, and I'm going to just do that for a few sentences. And what I did is I substituted the term Buddha for life. And so I want to read the first few sentences that way. The point of a relationship has nothing to do with the relationship itself. The point of a relationship is the added power that Buddha gets in working with it as a channel. A good relationship gives Buddha more power. If two people are strong together, Buddha has a more powerful channel than it has with two single people. It's almost as though a third and larger channel has been formed. That is what Buddha has been looking for. So you can read the rest of it that way, but I found it very interesting to substitute that term Buddha, or you could possibly even substitute Amida. But I think what, in my opinion, what Joko Beck is saying here is that one way of looking at a relationship is that that relationship is in service to some higher power or higher purpose in the universe. It's not just about me. It's not even just about us, meaning me and my wife, or me and my adult child. It's about something beyond that individual relationship. It's in service to a higher power or a higher purpose. And if you think about a car as an analogy to this, so if you have a car, you probably have four wheels and four tires on that car, and that's the only part of the car that touches the ground when you drive, right? Are those four tires. So let's say you get a flat tire, and now your car is stuck. You can't drive, right? So they tow your car into a garage, and the tire can't be fixed. It's unrepairable. And but the person says, well, we could put a new tire on for you, and then you'll be all set to go. And as long as you can afford it, you say, yeah, that's great. Go ahead and do that. And as the person who is the driver and the owner of the car, your basic view is I need to be able to transport myself and other people and objects in order to live my life properly. And so I'm concerned about the car being able to do this, right? And if the car needs a new tire, then we get a new tire. You're not really overly concerned about the flat tire, which no longer functions, but you're concerned about the purpose of the car. And I see that, in my opinion, that's what Joko Beck is saying here, is that if there is a higher power or a higher force or a higher purpose in the universe, it's not necessarily concerned with whether I'm having a good day in my relationship with my wife or I'm having a bad day because we had an argument. It's concerned with basically what are we doing to add value to Buddha's work in the universe. If Buddha is a compassionate Buddha, if Amida is a compassionate Buddha, what are we doing to basically manifest Buddha's compassion in the world? And that's what I think Buddha is concerned about. That's what life is concerned about. That's what a higher power is concerned about. So I found this a very provocative way of thinking about my relationship with my own wife and other relationships from the standpoint of, are we providing a kind of a vehicle or a channel for Buddha's work to get done in the world? So here are these 5 principles, ideas that come from Buddhism: interdependence, impermanence, awareness and suffering, jidiki and tariki, and relationships as a channel for Buddha's work in the world. And I think that these are really strong ideas and principles if we're trying to create a healthy, loving relationship with another person. And so we try to use these principles and figure out how can we integrate these principles in the way that we develop our relationship. But I think there are also principles that we want to try to bring into conflict resolution and problem solving when we have problems in those relationships. So in the same way that they can build a strong foundation, I think they can be part of a model for how we deal with our relationship when we come up against differences and conflicts and problems. So I'd like to, if it's okay with you, Marvin, to just pause for a minute, because I've covered a lot of ground, and I want to just see if anybody has any questions. We won't open it up like for a long period of time, but maybe just take 5 minutes and see if anyone has a question or a comment on what I've covered so far.
Okay,
I can't
sure.
see people, so I'll just
Yes.
basically kind of wait till I hear someone.
Okay, yes, sure. That let's take a question or two. If someone doesn't mind, their question will be on the recording, and I'll just, if anyone, if you would like to go ahead and interject a question, or of course I can't see if anyone has their hand raised, but
I have a question.
okay, go ahead.
I'm Judy.
Okay.
I would like Gregg to clarify a little bit more in detail the concept of grace as it relates to Buddhism.
Okay, thank you, Judy.
Okay, sure. That's a great question. And the grace is in the title of my first book on Naikan. It's Gratitude, Grace in the Japanese Art of Self-Reflection. And grace is generally considered to be a kind of Christian term, right? I think historically it's used often from a concept of looking at God's grace. But as I went through my own, spiritual development in terms of working with Naikan reflection, which involved going to Japan and spending a week or two just kind of in quiet sitting, but looking specifically at each year of my life. What I realized is that up until that point, which turns out to be almost exactly half a lifetime ago, I was in my early 30s. Up until that point, I don't think that I was particularly grateful for a lot of things, but I do think that I felt that I was relatively successful in a lot of ways because I was a very hardworking person that made a very strong effort. I have always been very persistent about kind of not giving up on things that were problems. So so the gratitude that I did have was often gratitude that I felt I had earned or deserved, right? And it wasn't until that I really began using Naikan to reflect on my life and to be able to see a couple of things. One of which was how much trouble and difficulty and suffering I had caused to all these people in my life, starting with my parents and my brother and people that I had worked with in different jobs, all of these ex-girlfriends. And I was a terrible boyfriend to a whole string of girlfriends prior to getting married. And I began to see that. And then at the same time, I began to see that many of the things that I considered to be kind of the view of myself as a giving person were actually not accurate. And just to give you a brief example, when I was in Japan on one of my trips, and I wanted to bring Linda a present. This is before we were married, and I went into a store in Kyoto and wanted to get her these nice little white Japanese slippers, right? And so somebody kind of helped me, and we tried to get an idea of her size, and they're very lightweight, if you know what kind of slippers I'm talking about. And so they packed them up in a box, and I gave them a credit card. And then I took them and I brought them back to the United States. And at some point, I wrapped them up and then I gave them to her as a gift. And there was a part of me that felt, very proud of that because I had given her this gift from Japan, even though they were just little slippers. But at one point, I sat down and I actually tried to make a chart, like a little map of everything that had to happen to get those slippers from Japan into Linda's hands. And so I looked at they had to be delivered to the store. Of course, they had to be made in the first place, but from my initial contact with them, I found them in the store. They had to be delivered to the store. Somebody had to put them out on display. So, and then the woman who helped me wrapped them up, put them in a box, which somebody provided. Even when I paid for them, I actually hadn't really paid for them at that point. I just gave them this plastic card. But then I took them home in a taxi. I took them back to my hotel. So they were transported in a taxi, and then they went into luggage that somebody else manufactured for me. They went on a plane, and I didn't even have to deal with them on the plane. They were just in my suitcase, and someone else was flying that plane, right? So I just sat in my seat reading a book or watching a movie and eating some good Japanese food. And meanwhile, these slippers were being transported across the world. And I can go on and on. And what I realized is that I was really no more than a messenger. I was just a person who basically transported these slippers from the store in a taxi and ultimately to an airplane, and then transported them off the airplane and put them in Linda's hands. But there were so many other forces of the universe that had contributed. It was hard for me to really see that I had that much of a role in giving her those slippers. I was kind of just a little cog in that whole process. There's a story that I've always loved about this Milkonin Genza, where he delivers, I think, some sweet potatoes to someone, and the woman is very, very thankful and says, "Oh, thank you so much for bringing the sweet potatoes. And he says, don't thank me, thank the sweet potatoes. And I think it's this recognition, which is really based in truth, that the role that I play and that I think we often play when we do something for someone or give something to somebody is often a role that we only see like our part in it. But actually, when we look at the whole cast of characters, we really have kind of a small part in that. And so the combination of seeing the limitations of what I had done and given to others, along with the great difficulties and trouble and suffering I had caused, I began to have a sense that that my life was good at that point, not because of what I was doing, but because in spite of what I was doing. So it was a form of grace in the sense that I had a good life, but not because I had earned that life, but because that life had been bestowed on me, even though I didn't deserve it. And as I look back to the beginning of my own marriage, my life now has far exceeded any expectations that I had for it 32 years ago. I can't believe what a wonderful life that I have, and I would have never expected it to be this wonderful 32 years ago. And so I think grace to me, from a Buddhist standpoint, connects with Amida's compassion or Buddha's compassion or the Bodhisattva's compassion. But it's more than just compassion, because it comes with this view that it's not something that I've earned or deserved. And I think that's what helps us to see it as grace rather than something that's just kind of a gift. So does that answer your question at all, Judy?
Yes, yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Judy, for that excellent question and giving Gregg the opportunity to explain the meaning of grace.
Yeah.
Would you like to continue on with your presentation now, and then
Yeah, why don't I go into
Yeah.
the next section, and then we'll
Okay.
have a nice big block of time, hopefully.
Okay.
And Marvin, if you could keep me on track with the time, I just want to make sure that
Sure.
that I do leave enough time. So so this next section I want to talk about is really very practical. It's about kind of a method of conflict resolution. It's something that many elements of this I use and have used myself in terms of personal conflicts. And so I want to share this with you and offer you something that I think has the potential to help you be more skillful as you kind of try to manage your differences or solve problems with people that are important to you in your life. So the first thing I want to talk about is prevention, meaning conflict prevention, right? And the best way I know how to talk about that is from this story about EQ called Crooked Trees. And I wrote about this many years ago. Some of you may know this Buddhist story about EQ, but EQ was a monk. He was a kind of wandering monk. And there was a governor of a particular province in Japan at the time. And there was this solitary tree in this open area, but it was extremely crooked, extremely bent, right? Very noticeable. And the governor put a sign in front of that tree saying, anybody who can see this crooked tree as straight, I will give them a valuable prize, right? And so as people walked by this area with this tree, they saw the sign and they were curious. So some people walked over to the tree. They tried to get a really close-up look. Some people actually walked away and tried to look at the tree from a distance, or they walked around the tree. Some people actually walked over to the tree and they laid down under the tree to kind of look at it from the ground up, look at it vertically. And one person even brought this big, tall wooden ladder so that he could try to get above the tree and look from the top down. But nobody was able to actually solve this riddle. And then EQ came along and he sees this tree and he sees the sign. And he immediately goes to the governor's palace and he says, I want to see the governor because I've solved the riddle. And so he goes in and the governor says, so tell me, how did you solve the riddle? of seeing that crooked tree as straight. And EQ just looks at him and says, it's crooked. That's it. That's his solution to the riddle. It's crooked. And the governor says, well, you deserve a prize. And so the question is, what was it about saying that the tree is crooked that allowed him to solve that riddle? And I believe that it's because by seeing the crooked tree as crooked, he was able to see it as straight. So let me tell you what I mean by that by using an analogy to our relationships with people, which is the purpose of the story from my standpoint. The term crooked, if you go back to my early years or my dad's generation, they used the term crooked usually to talk about politicians who were dishonest, crooked politicians. So it often had this connotation of someone who is dishonest. But there's lots of ways I think a person can be crooked in this sense of a crooked person. They can be crooked in the sense that they're selfish. They can be crooked in the sense that that they talk too much, or maybe they're too shy, or maybe they're too preoccupied with their health and they're always talking about their aches and pains. Or maybe the person is crooked because the only time you hear from them is when they want something from you. In other words, when we see all of these different faults in people, those people become the crooked trees in our life, right? And and so if you look at the people in your life, if you were honest, you could probably see at least one, if not many faults in most of those people, if not all of them. And so you're kind of surrounded by all these crooked trees. And so your challenge is, how can you see a crooked tree as straight? It's the same challenge as EQ had in terms of the actual tree. How can you see a crooked person as basically a straight person? How can you see a person who is very imperfect as perfect? How can you see a person who has all kinds of weaknesses and faults as basically someone who is perfect just as they are? Now, the governor could have posted a sign that said something like, here's this crooked tree. I'll give you a prize if you can straighten out this crooked tree. And that would have been a different challenge, right? That's not the challenge the governor wanted to offer, and it's not the challenge that EQ solved, but it's a challenge that many of us take when we're surrounded by crooked trees. And what I mean to say is that our challenge becomes, how do I straighten out this crooked tree, right? Here's my sister, and she's handling her life this way. And I don't know why she doesn't just take my advice and do this other thing instead, because it would solve her problem. But she doesn't understand that. She doesn't see it, even though I've told her like so many times, this is what you need to do. So that's an example of trying to basically make a crooked tree straight. Or with our adult children, or with our adult parents, who won't seem to take our advice, even though they're getting so old, right? And they don't realize we know what's best for them. So we often spend a huge amount of our time and energy and effort trying to straighten out the crooked trees in our life. And of course, we're a crooked tree ourselves, but we don't really recognize that we're a crooked tree also. But we are, because we're all crooked trees. We put all this energy into trying to straighten out all these crooked trees, whereas the really fruitful challenge would be, how do you see a crooked tree as straight? So the reason I mention this story is because it has to do with preventing conflict. I think that if there is a single thing that I could suggest that would help us prevent conflict in our relationships, it would be to stop trying to straighten out the crooked trees in our life. Stop trying to fix the people around us. Stop trying to fix their lives. Stop trying to get them to do what we think they should do, right? And instead, just recognize them as straight. They're a crooked tree, and we see them as crooked, and we just recognize, oh, this is basically a straight tree. This is how they are. This is who they are. And that leaves all of this energy then for us to be basically working on our own life, right? Instead of putting our efforts into trying to straighten out all the trees around us, the one life we might be able to influence is our own, if we had some of this energy to do that. So when I talk about prevention and crooked trees, what I'm really saying is that we have to stop trying to control other people and fix their lives. And by the way, much of the time that we're trying to fix other people's lives, it's not coming from necessarily a motive which is selfish. Sometimes it is, but often it's coming from a motive where we think that we're being compassionate. We think we're helpful. We're being helpful by doing this. But whether it's coming from a helpful motive or a compassionate motive, we're still trying to straighten out the crooked tree. And it's not something that we can succeed in doing 99% of the time. So the one thing I want to offer you today about kind of preventing conflict is to basically let people be crooked trees, see them as straight, and stop trying to fix and control them. And I think if we can do that, we can actually prevent a certain amount of conflict. Even if we did that perfectly, we'll still have conflict with people because I think it's just part of being human. But I think we'd have less conflict if we were able to do that. I want to mention this just because I think people often over time develop a preferred style of how they deal with conflict. And so I've identified three here, and we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I just want to introduce it to you, and maybe you'll think about it in terms of what you gravitate towards. I think most people gravitate towards avoiding conflict, meaning we don't really want to deal with conflict, and we certainly don't want to deal with trying to resolve conflict. It creates anxiety, it creates tension, it makes us feel uncomfortable. So we basically try to avoid it. And there's two ways we avoid it. One is we withdraw. We just basically don't even acknowledge the conflict, or if it becomes obvious, we just kind of move away and withdraw to doing something else. Or we just concede. In other words, the other person, there's a conflict of person, this is what they want, and you just say, okay, we'll do it your way. Or, yeah, that sounds fine. And that may sound like a very kind of spiritually mature response. But the problem is, if that's a pattern that you have in dealing with conflict with people, that you're always essentially conceding to what it is that they want, you're actually poisoning those people. You're poisoning them because you're reinforcing the idea that winning from their standpoint is something that they should be trying to do. That by allowing people to always get their way, I don't think you're actually helping them. I don't think you're actually supporting their spiritual maturity or development. I don't think you're supporting their personal development. If they continue to get reinforced that if they push hard enough, they'll get their way. So sometimes it's important. It's actually, I think, skillful to avoid conflict. Sometimes it's skillful to just give the other person what they want. But if it's a pattern we have, then I think it's good to look at that, because I don't think as an overall pattern, it's a healthy way to deal with conflict. The second thing, which is also listed as number one on the slide, which is a mistake. But the second thing is compete to win. So when we watch the Olympics, you see a race, there's 10 runners and they're going to run 1,000 meters, and they're on the starting line, and the shot goes off and they start running as fast as they can, and they're all trying to basically get to the finish line first, right? So they're all trying to win, and one person is going to win. And I think that works well in the Olympics for a couple of reasons. One is that's actually what they're there for, right? The game is a competition. Everybody understands that the purpose of being there is to get to the finish line first. But secondly, for the most part, that runner from Kenya or from the Czech Republic, they're not going to have a relationship with those other 9 runners after that race is over or after the Olympics are over. So they don't have a relationship to nurture except whatever goes on during that actual race for a few minutes. And I think it's very different from being in a relationship with someone when you do have an ongoing relationship with that person. And I know people, whose basic style of resolving conflict is to try to win, meaning they try to get their way. And they bring that style to virtually every conflict that they have. And it becomes very hard for people to deal with them because they know whenever there's a difference of opinion or a problem, this person is going to be pushing their solution because they think it's the best solution. So again, I think that style might work in the Olympics, but it's usually not a style that's going to work from a relationship standpoint, because you're going to alienate people, and people basically will kind of start withdrawing from you because it's not pleasant to try to solve a conflict with that kind of person. The third style, which is to collaborate and compromise, to me is the style that most often contributes to a healthy relationship. And the difference between those two things is collaboration means that you find a solution in which everybody wins. In other words, everybody gets their needs met in a collaborative situation. That's not always possible. And so sometimes you compromise, meaning that everybody gets something. They get at least some of their preferences or needs or interests met, and they give up something. And in doing that, I think there's often a sense of success in terms of trusting the other person, feeling like they are concerned about you and your needs and interests because they were willing to give up something. So collaboration and compromise, I think, is a strategy that most often contributes to a healthy relationship. Now, before we can actually have a dialogue or a conversation with someone to resolve a conflict, there has to be an invite. Now, many times many people don't recognize this. So if you're upset with something, you went to temple on Sunday and something happened there with your partner, and he or she did something that really bothered you or upset you, and so you want to talk to that person about it. You want to talk to them about it. And so maybe you actually go up to them and say, when we went to temple yesterday, we're having that conversation with such and such couple, and you made these comments about me, and it really hurt my feelings. And I was very angry about that, and I still am very angry about that. So what you're doing is you're skipping the invite, right? You're just launching into, I want to talk to you about this, and I'm going to start the conversation by pointing at you and attacking you and criticizing you. And for many of us who have tried that, it's not unusual to get not a good outcome from that kind of situation. So my suggestion is that you start with an invite, that you don't what I call ambush someone into a conflict resolution discussion. You go up to a person, you give them a general idea that you have a concern, and you may mention something about that concern in a general way, but you don't blame them. You don't do this with an emotional charge, and you simply tell them what the topic is. And then you say, would you be willing to talk with me about this? And if yes, then you say, well, when would be a good time? Could we agree on a time when we could have this conversation? And so what you've done now is you've given them a heads up that you're concerned about something, you want to have a conversation about it. They have some idea what it is that you're concerned about. So they have a chance to emotionally and psychologically prepare for that conversation. They have a chance to think about it. You're not catching them off guard. You're not kind of like suddenly tossing this right onto them when they had no idea it was coming. So I almost always recommend, even particularly in work situations, but also in personal situations, that you check with the person. They may say, this isn't really a good time, or I have to, I've got this presentation I have to make, or I have this report that's due that I'm gonna have to stay up all night doing. So could we have this conversation, anytime after Monday or something? And that's great, because if you had that conversation when they're under a lot of stress, the likelihood that they're going to be responsive to what you say goes way down. I also suggest that if you're going to invite somebody, if possible, you do it face-to-face. If not face-to-face, you do it on the phone, but that you avoid texting or messaging. Texting and messaging, to me, are terrible vehicles for any kind of problem solving or conflict resolution. So even the invite, I suggest you not do that by text or email if you have the option of doing it with your voice or in person. All right, so the third stage is what I call softening the heart. And there's three aspects to this. So this is what you're doing right before you would have the conversation. Again, this is preparation. So why do you need preparation? Why can't you just sit down and say, okay, I've got this problem with you. You did this, got me very upset. I want to talk about because I'm very angry. So one of the reasons that you do something in preparation that I call softening the heart is because if both people, and if you've been in this situation, you know from experience, if both people go into that conversation feeling very angry at the other person, because you may be angry at them, but there's probably a good chance that they're angry at you as well. Maybe they're angry at you for how you handled things after you were angry at them. But in many cases, when you get into a conflict discussion, both people can be coming in angry and tense and very upset. Excuse me. So the question is there something you can do before you have that conversation that would help soften you to being able to have a dialogue and a conversation in which you're capable not just of telling that person what they did that hurt you or that was wrong, but you're capable of actually listening and trying to understand where the other person is coming from. Because ultimately, without that, it's very hard to have any kind of successful problem solving or negotiation or conflict resolution. So the three parts of this that I suggest is the first is Naikan reflection. And many of you may be familiar with this already. There's lots of material I've written about it. Other people have written about it. But it's a very simple process. And it simply means that before you sit down with the other person, you sit down alone and you look at these three questions. And I'm going to move this slide just to show you those questions, and then I'll come back. The first question is, what have I received from this person? You look at a time period. It might be the last 2 days, the last week, last month, but you just simply make a list of what I've received from the other person. What have I given during the same period of time? And what troubles and difficulties have I caused? And it's always recommended that you spend half of the time on that third question. So when Linda and I do this, we usually do a total of about 30 minutes for the three questions, and we try to spend 15 minutes. So she's looking at how have I caused Gregg trouble and difficulty during this period of time? And I'm looking at how have I caused Linda trouble and difficulty during this period of time? And I want to be clear, neither of us really wants to answer that question because we're so upset or angry or focused on how the other person caused us trouble. But that's why it's such an important question, because it changes our perspective. It gives us an opportunity to try to understand the perspective of the other person in the relationship. And so if we can answer that question and think of some things that we've done that cause trouble, then that helps, I think, to humble us and soften us a little bit to the other person instead of coming in with a very angry or upset attitude and just simply focusing on what they did that has got us so upset. So this is the first part of the softening process, is to just work on these three questions and write down the answers. The second part is apologies. And I always suggest that you find three things you can apologize for, but it could just be one thing. And it doesn't have to even be related to the problem. It can be something completely different that's unrelated to the problem. But you can say, last week, I couldn't sleep. And I remember, going into the bathroom and I made all this noise, and then I woke you up and you couldn't get back to sleep. And I'm sorry that I woke you up. And it might not have anything to do with the issue that you wanted to talk about, but it's a situation where you're looking at yourself and you're realizing that you caused that person trouble, and you're willing to actually apologize for it, which from that person's standpoint, it kind of makes them more open to you, because there's nothing that makes us, I think, as open to the other person as when they recognize that they've caused us some kind of suffering and they're willing to come to us and acknowledge it and even apologize for it. So, so in addition to the Naikan, and in that third question, you may find some things you can apologize for, but you basically find 1, 2, 3 things that you can each apologize for. And then the third thing is that you do a spiritual reading, and you find something that you feel can really touch you, touch your heart. In Christianity, and even as a Buddhist, I really love the St. Francis prayer. Some of you may be familiar with that, but could be a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh, could be some little passage from a Dharma talk that you heard or read, but some kind of reading that you use kind of prior to sitting down and having this conversation. So some type of self-reflection, apology, and then a spiritual reading. And I think if you do that, there's at least a reasonably good chance that both of you will go into that conversation with a possibility of actually being able to not just talk, but hear what the other person is saying, to listen to them, and then to be able to actually have a dialogue that isn't so emotionally charged and angry. So now we get to kind of the part where you're actually sitting down and talking, and I'm going to lay out a number of different elements of this. It doesn't mean that you have to work with all of these things, but these are all things that I've worked with personally and with other people that I think help make the odds that you're going to have a successful outcome from this effort to resolve a conflict, makes those odds go up. So, so I'm going to mention 9 things, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. We can then open it up to some dialogue and discussion. So the first thing is you agree on the problem. And this sounds so simple that most people don't even think about it, because you're sitting down and it's very clear to you that the problem is, and I'll give you a real example in my own life. The problem is that you had to go to a doctor's appointment, and you left a little bit late, but you still had just enough time to get there, and you got in the car. There's only one car that you share with your partner, and the gas tank was empty. The needle was like almost completely on E. When you started the car, a little light comes on saying you don't have much gas left. So you had to stop at a gas station, go out of your way to get to a gas station. You were late for your appointment, right? So you see that as the problem, but the other person doesn't necessarily see that as the problem, and so they may have a completely different take on it. They may say like, well, the reason, they may, for example, say that, well, I did return the car without gas, but when I got in the car yesterday to go to the grocery store, to go shopping, the car was already below a quarter of a tank. And our agreement is it's supposed to be filled up when it gets to a quarter of a tank, and you drove the car. So you actually caused the problem before I even got in the car yesterday. But I'll give you a novel way to look at the problem, which I think actually has the best chance of succeeding in this particular example and in other examples. So you have this agreement: when the tank gets to a quarter, the person who's driving is supposed to fill the tank up. But you get in the car and the tank's virtually empty. So what's the problem? Most people would say, well, the problem is the other person didn't fill the tank up. But I'm going to suggest that that's not the problem. That the problem is that you don't have gas in the car. That's the problem. And so that's a problem that other person might agree with. You both agree, yeah, you have a medical appointment, you don't have enough gas to get your appointment. That's the problem. And if that becomes the problem, then the question is, well, what's the solution? So obviously in that case, the solution was that you have to get to your medical appointment, and so you have to stop for gas. But for instance, in my garage, I keep a 3 or 4 gallon thing that I use for our lawn tractor and other kind of mechanical things that take gas. So I could solve the problem by just pouring that gas in the tank. And the thing is that by making the problem, there's not enough gas in the car for me to get where I'm going, you're not actually attacking the other person. You're not saying this is your fault or you did this. You're saying the problem is I have a medical appointment and I don't have enough gas to get there. So how do we solve that problem? And there's a better chance that you're going to come up with a solution in which you can agree or recommit to a solution to the problem of not having gas in the car if you define the problem that way than if you define the problem is what the other person did. A second thing is to identify common ground. There are, I think, a lot of conflicts that we have where we have common ground, meaning we have similar outcomes we're looking for, or similar concerns, or similar interests. And I want to share with you a story from Reverend Tai Uno. It's one of my favorite stories of his. If I can pull this up here. That's from River of Fire, River of Water. I think it was his first popular book on Shin Buddhism. And I knew Reverend Uno fairly well. He had many years when he was in Northampton, about 4 hours south of where we are in Vermont, and we'd have dinner with him. I've been to his house and met his lovely wife Alice many times. So he writes, I still recall one of the first big fights that I had with my wife and partner Alice. It happened some years ago, one early summer evening when we lived in Los Angeles. We received a telephone call and had to go out on an emergency. Alice dressed our son Mark, this is Mark Uno, who was 2 years old at the time, an active little boy. He perspired easily, but she made him wear a jacket that evening, thinking that it would be too warm for him. I took it off and put on a sweater. Alice saw this, took off the sweater, and put the jacket back on. Mark, I yelled at her, saying that he would run around, perspire, and catch a cold, and I took the jacket off and I made him wear the sweater. And then she really got upset, jerked the sweater off, and shouted at me with a barrage of accusations. You don't know what's best for your son. You're never home. You don't play with him. You're an ungrateful husband, and on and on. And I too exploded with angry expletives that I can't even remember today, but I do remember yelling at the end, I should have married your sister. In the meanwhile, our son was running around in the front yard wearing just a t-shirt, perspiring and catching a cold. Here we see two people with good intentions concerned with a potential problem and proposing to do what's best, but we both act as if we know what's best for the situation, unaware of the hidden landmines. And so the reason I mentioned this story, first, I love that he was willing to share this because he to me is one of the most wisest people that I have met in terms of Buddhist teachers, and still he could get caught up with his wife in this kind of an argument. But I think that what we see is that the common ground they have here is really important because they're both concerned about the health and welfare of their son. They're both concerned about that. So if you sit down to have a conversation with someone that you have a conflict with, it's always great to start with, do we have common ground? You know, so even though you may have differences of opinion about what you think is best, what the other person think is best, if you can find at some level some common ground, then you start on a really good note, right? We're both concerned about this. We both have this interest. We both have this idea of how we want this to work out. Right? So identifying that common ground in the beginning is really helpful. And then the third one on this side is agree on guidelines for the conversation. And Linda and I always do this when we sit down. We always basically say, what are the guidelines? And the guidelines may be that you don't interrupt the other person. The guidelines may be that we don't criticize the other person in the conversation, that we don't raise our voice. So whatever guidelines you want to have, this is the time to set them in the beginning of the conversation rather than once you get started. The fourth is to involve these 4, 5, and 6 involve these shifts. The first shift is from an attachment to a position to clarity about what your needs or interests are, right? So in Reverend Uno's story, you see that they each have the same interest, which is the health of their son. But they're attached to their position, which in one case is he should wear a sweater, and the other case is he should wear a jacket. And so often one of the reasons that we can't resolve conflicts is because each person gets attached to a position. a specific solution to the problem that they're attached to. The other person has a specific solution they're attached to, and then it becomes a fight to see who's going to budge, right? But if you think about what your interest is, well, my interest is in my son's health. Well, my interest is in my son's health. You back off your attachment from a position, and you instead look at what's important to you, what your interests, your needs are. And when you do that, you open up some ground for you to be able to either collaborate or compromise on a solution. The fifth thing is that the shift is a shift from speech in which you're judgmental to a shift in which you're factual and objective, right? So we're judgmental in a positive way when a partner does something great for us, really kind for us, and we say, oh, she's really wonderful, or he's really wonderful. That's a judgment, right? Wonderful is a concept. It's not really a fact, it's a judgment. It happens to be a positive judgment. But it's also true when we say, oh, the person did something that really created problems or troubles for us, and we say, that person's awful, or that person's selfish. Those are judgments also. And when we use judgments in conversations, it tends to stimulate anger. It tends to create more of an emotional charge. So one of the things you can try is to stay away from using judging terms and just use descriptive terms. So I remember, I can give you two examples from my own life. One was a situation where I had a habit of leaving my towel on the doorknob of the bathroom instead of hanging it up where I could hang the towel up on the little hook, right? And Linda was very skillful about this. Instead of coming in and just saying, why are you so lazy that you can't even take an extra like 5 seconds to take the towel off the doorknob and put it up on the hook where it's supposed to be? And had she started that way, I would have had a particular reaction to that. But instead, she actually came to me and she said, when you put the towel on the doorknob, I can't actually close the door when I go to the bathroom. That's all she said. And that was it. That was the end of the conversation. And ever since then, I have never put the towel on the doorknob, maybe one time. But because I think of that, because she was just pointing out an objective fact and the impact that it had on her. There was no judgment involved. There was no accusation involved. She was just saying, when you do this, I have this problem. And that was it. That was the end of the discussion. And it got solved because I heard what she was saying. I didn't want her to have that problem. And so I responded to it in a very constructive way. And the same thing has happened in reverse. I remember saying to her once, as we were leaving to go someplace, I'd come back into the house and I said, I think, the iron that you were using to iron the shirt was still plugged in. So the iron wasn't on, but it was still plugged in, which in my opinion is dangerous from a safety standpoint. That's all I said is I went in the house to get something out of the bedroom. I noticed the iron was plugged in. I didn't say anything else. And it's never happened since. So it can be very effective to try to think in terms of descriptions of reality, objective descriptions of fact, as opposed to judgments that almost are always part of accusations that we make. The third thing is a shift from speech in which we're trying to send a message to listening with curiosity. And this is, I think, maybe one of the most difficult shifts to make, because if you're upset or angry with somebody and there's a conflict, you go into that dialogue, and in the forefront of your consciousness is, I need to tell them what they did and why I'm so angry about it. You have a message to send, right? One of the other principles, I didn't put this on the slide, but it just made me think of it, that we use in Japanese psychology is this idea of if you get upset about something someone else did, that you stick it in your hara for 48 hours. And Linda would often do this as a practice. If I did something that bothered her or upset her, she sticks it in her hara. If you know what your hara is, this little kind of center of your spiritual self. It's kind of right below your belly button. You stick it in your hara, meaning that you hold on to it. You don't talk about it. You don't say anything about it. You don't act out on it. And you wait 48 hours. And after 48 hours, then you decide, is this something I need to talk about with this person? And when she was experimenting this, she found that more than not. After 48 hours was up, it didn't seem like a big deal. It didn't seem like something that needed to have a conversation or have a problem-solving discussion. So we just moved on. So there's times when you have a very emotional and upsetting response to something in that moment, but if you stick it in your hara for a day or two, maybe it's not even important enough to actually talk about. Or if it is, you can talk about it now, probably with less of an emotional charge. But number 6 here is really about going into that discussion where you want to basically focus on what is going on with the other person. You want to focus on listening and understanding and being curious about that. A good question that you can ask in terms of curiosity is like the question when somebody's talking to you in a problem-solving discussion or a conflict, can you help me understand why you're saying that, or what makes you say that, or why you feel like that, or why you're so upset about that? Can you help me understand? You're looking for more information. And that's very different than sending the message about what you're so angry about. Okay. The last 3 are when it comes to listening, particularly if there's a lot of emotional charge in the conversation, take the time before you respond to someone. If you've ever been in a situation where people are talking to you and you immediately start thinking about how you're going to respond, what you're going to say, even though they're not finished talking. So instead, if you basically listen to what they have to say, and then it's part of the ground rules that each person repeats back to the other person, not in the same words, but in their own words, what they just heard, right? So that person is clear that basically you heard and understand what they said. You hear the term active listening, for example, as a term to describe that, but it slows down the process, takes more time, but I feel like it actually helps because then each person has a sense that what they're saying is being understood. There are times when I've used and I've suggested people use an actual timer to go back and forth in a conversation, because otherwise one or the other person will say, well, you talk too much. You're talking too long. You're going on, and I can't respond, you know? And so you set a timer for 2 or 3 minutes. That person has 2 or 3 minutes to say what they have to say. The other person says, this is what I heard you say. And then the other person gets to have 2 or 3 minutes to say what they have to say. So timer can basically take away this issue of one person's talking more, the other person's not being able to get in some airtime to express themselves by just basically using a timer. And finally, take a break if things get heated or too emotionally charged. You don't have to sit down and stay in that conversation until you figure things out. Sometimes it's good just to go through the process, get to a point where everybody understands the other person's position, and then let's get together again. Maybe tomorrow night after dinner we can talk about this a little bit more, and take some time off, take a break. And then the finale, as I would call it. Now I'm back to this slide. So I'm just going to stop my screen share completely. In the finale, if you come to an agreement, even about some small aspect of it, write it down. First, make sure that you're both agreeing to the same thing. You'd be surprised how many times people leave a conversation like this thinking that they actually have an agreement, but they didn't agree to the same thing. So write it down so you have it in writing, and clarify that what you're agreeing to, and then celebrate. Basically, as a in your relationship, you just basically got through a difficult situation. So can you have some kind of celebration? So the last thing I want to do, if I can do this, is to share with you my favorite words of wisdom from the best relationship guru that I know. And to do this, I'm going to try to share my screen. And this is a video, if I can bring this up. And I might not be able to. Let's see. Okay, and let's see if this works. Can you see that, Marvin? Is she up there?
Yes, we can see it. It's got the little, it's not, yeah, it's good. It's good. Go ahead and
Okay.
play it.
Mom, are you ready to be his friend?
Yes.
Try not to be that high up to be friends. I want everything to be low. Okay?
Okay.
Just try your best. I don't want you and my dad to be replaced and meanies again. I want you and my dad to be placed as settled and be friends. I'm not trying to be mean. I just want everyone to be friends. And if I can be nice, I think all of us can be nice too. I'm not trying to be mean, but I'm trying to do my best in my heart. Nothing else than that. I want you, Mom, my dad, everyone to be friends. I want everyone to be smiling, not like being mad. I want everything to smile. Especially when I see someone, I want them to smile. Especially Nana, everyone. I want everyone to smile. And if that's for my dad and you, Mom, I think you can do it. I think you can settle your mean heights down a little to short heights. Then it's both, okay? I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be a bully. I'm trying to be steady on the floor, not way down, on straight, on the middle where my heart is. My heart is something. Everyone else's heart is something too. And if we live in a world where everyone's being mean, everyone's going to be a monster in their future. What if there's just a little bit of persons and we will eat them, then no one will ever be here. Only the monsters in our place. We need everyone to be a person. Everyone, including me and my mom, everyone. I just want everything to be settled down. Nothing else. I just want everything to be good as possible. Nothing else.
Thank you, Tana.
So I don't know if you've seen that before. That was Jenna. I think of her as kind of the bodhisattva of conflict resolution. She's like a little Thich Nhat Hanh or something like that. And her video is just up on YouTube. I came across it years ago, and I just love that presentation. So we have a little time left. I apologize for going so long, but we can go ahead and open things up for discussion and questions.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much, Greg, for that wonderful presentation. So much food for thought, and I gained so much. But let's go right into any questions that anyone has. Maybe we'll stop the recording, and then you can speak freely and ask any questions. Or if you even want to put it on gallery view, that's fine.